Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the annual Harvard Yenjing Roundtable. Today's roundtable is entitled Asia's Growing Generation Gap, Causes and Consequences. I'm Liz Perry, director of the Harvard Yenjing Institute, and it's my pleasure to serve as moderator for this roundtable today. As some of you know, every spring the Harvard Yenjing Institute sponsors a roundtable in conjunction with the annual meeting of the Association for Asian Studies. The Institute sponsors a keynote speaker from Asia, a scholar from Asia, and then in conjunction with that keynote, we invite the keynote speaker here to Harvard and try to build an informal roundtable around some of the interests of the speaker. This year's annual AAS meeting was just concluded in Washington, D.C. this past weekend. How many of you were at the AAS meeting in Washington? Oh, quite a few. Okay. So perhaps some of you heard Professor Cho at that meeting. The keynote speaker this year was Professor Cho Haejoang from Yonsei University, and her keynote address at the AAS meeting was entitled Generation, Connection, and Reciprocity, Hopes for a United Front of Youth Precariat in East Asia. Today's roundtable was inspired by some of Professor Cho's interests, and we invited three other Asia-based scholars from different parts of Asia, from China, Japan, Hong Kong, who reflect a diversity of opinion, a diversity of approach, and also a diversity of scholarly generations. And so we anticipate a lively discussion this afternoon among them and also with you. We hope today to exchange some ideas about the sources and the significance of a possible generational difference across contemporary East Asia. This title today, Growing Generation Gap, perhaps should have concluded with a question mark instead of a colon, because I think some of the speakers today will suggest that when we get down at least to the individual families in East Asia, there may not be such a generation gap as we sometimes imagine to be the case. But we will ask to what extent various recent trends in demography, trends in education, trends in family socialization, in popular culture, in media technology, in labor markets, and so forth, have or have not led to significant differences between younger and older generations. Have they led to differences in identity and outlook between young people and their parents and their grandparents in East Asia? And what might the future impact of these differences actually be? We want to look also across Asian societies. We want to ask whether younger generations in different parts of Asia are drawing closer together because of shared popular culture and shared media, social media, and other forms of technology, or whether they are growing further apart from each other, perhaps pulled apart by a rising tide of nationalism in various countries of Asia, a nationalism that also to some extent is promoted and intensified by these same social media. I think there's no denying that younger people in East Asia these days face unusual burdens, expectations, and responsibilities. Declining birth rates have created major demographic imbalances in Asia, with a dwindling population, a dwindling proportion of younger people responsible for a growing contingent of elderly. In China, the effects of the one-child policy are now coming home to roost. What was hailed a decade or so ago as China's wonderful demographic dividend that was seen as fueling a dynamic economy because of its younger, healthier, and better educated workforce is now more commonly referred to as a demographic deficit. the problem of a rapidly aging population without enough young people to support this increasing number of elderly. And moreover, unlike Japan or South Korea, China is growing old before it has really gotten rich. And so the problems that face China translate into meager public welfare and therefore more expectation that society will move in to fill the gap. In addition to these worrisome demographic trends, we see educational patterns in Asia that have also created major challenges for the younger generation. The past couple of decades have seen a remarkable massification of higher education across Asia, especially in China and India. A decade ago, it was the United States that led the world, as it had for a very long time, in terms of number of college and university students. Today, China is first in the world in terms of the number of its college and university students, with India second, and the United States a fairly distant third. 30 years ago, far less than 10% of Chinese of the college-age cohort actually were fortunate enough to go to college or universities. Today, the percentage enrolled in higher education is well above 30% and still growing very, very rapidly. This newfound access to higher education obviously is a very positive development in many respects. But it also has put severe pressure on the new wave of college graduates to find jobs that are commensurate with their educational achievements. The so-called ant tribes, the Yizu of China's inner cities, these college graduates who live in slum-like conditions because they're unable to find jobs that are equivalent to their educational background, is indicative of this problem. For young people who feel at sea in this rapidly changing world, the prospects may sometimes appear grim, at times perhaps even hopeless. We see very high suicide rates among young people in Asia, often attributed to the unbearable school and examination pressures as more and more of them strive to compete and enter first extremely competitive educational systems and then very competitive workforce markets. In China, suicide now is the fifth leading cause of death overall, and it is the leading cause of death among people ages 15 to 34. China has an annual suicide rate of 22.2 per 100,000 population, but it's certainly not the worst in Asia. Japan has a higher rate, 24.4 fatalities, and South Korea much higher still, 31.1. In fact, South Korea is among the very highest rates in the world. In the United States as well, if we look at this grim statistic, currently the United States is at a 30-year high in levels of suicide, although much lower than these comparons in Asia, 13 deaths per 100,000, but in the United States also the biggest increase has been among the young. So in light of these rather sobering trends, when we first put together this workshop, this roundtable, I thought it was inevitably likely to be a rather depressing event. After all, our common stereotype, not only for Asia, but for the United States as well, depicts the younger generation as too absorbed in their video games or their social media to care very much about more than their own self-interest, or at best maybe their virtual networks. And those virtual networks are often depicted as sites of self-indulgence or bullying, where people paste or post rather flattering pictures of themselves or belittle those who are less fortunate themselves. But I must say that what's been happening in this country in the last few weeks has greatly improved my outlook about the generation in the United States. The current anti-gun movement is perhaps the one very bright spot in an otherwise rather dispiriting social and political landscape. And if we look at Asia, We see not so long ago the Occupy Central and Umbrella movement in Hong Kong. We see the Sunflower movement in Taiwan, indicating that young people in Asia, too, are willing to organize and even sacrifice for causes bigger than themselves. Those same electronic devices that contribute to youthful indulgence or youthful alienation or isolation or state surveillance can also be put to much more positive ends. So rather than simply depoliticizing their users, these tools may actually embolden and empower them, facilitating the mobilization of sometimes quite inspiring social movements that begin with the younger generation and then spread out to the citizenry at large. So we have today a very complex topic. I think some of our speakers will paint a more optimistic and rosier picture, others of them less optimistic and less rosy, as befits this very complex topic. And fortunately, we have four very knowledgeable scholars to help us understand this terrain. We're going to hear first from Professor Cho Haejoang of Yonsei University in Korea, then Professor Ishida Hiroshi of the University of Tokyo, Japan, and then Professor Teresa Kuan of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, finally Professor Shen Yifei of Fudan University in Shanghai. So they're arrayed in that order here. I'll very briefly introduce each of them just before they speak. Then each of them will give a fairly short presentation. Then we'll have time, if they want, for the panelists to discuss among themselves or to ask each other questions or to disagree with one another. And then most importantly, we will open things up to the audience so that we can have a real back and forth exchange here. So our first presenter will be Professor Cho, who is Professor Emerita of the Department of Cultural Anthropology of Yonsei University in Korea. She taught at the Department of Sociology and then in the Department of Cultural Anthropology there before retiring just a few years ago. Her early research focused on gender studies in modern Korea. And her research spans the question of gender and youth culture and modernity. She's written a number of different books. I'll mention just a few of them. Women and Men in South Korea, Children Refusing School, and Society Refusing Children, Talking at the Edge, Letters Between Japanese and Korean Feminists, and much, much more. Professor Cho is the founding director of the Haejoang Center, also known as the Seoul Youth Factory for Alternative Culture, which she launched as a kind of educational and cultural platform for teenagers since 1999. The center tries to solve some of the problems facing contemporary youth from perspectives of feminism, cultural studies, and ecological studies. So first, let me turn to Professor Cho.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for coming. I have to push this one, right? Okay. We have only 10 minutes, so I will be talking about several dimensions. If we are going to talk about generational gap, I think we should be aware of these three dimensions. One is compressed modernity, that the change has been so compressed. In Korea, for example, we have the generation of economic growth and generation of consumer society and generation of neoliberal era, and they have such a different structure of emotions and expectations and values. So this is a Japanese psychotherapist, I think. Ohira again classified them as a hot, cool, and warm. Hot people is always ready to do and think they can fix anything and the world will get better. And cool generation is more like hippies, you care yourself and I will take care of myself. And they don't care so much about other stuff. But at least they want to have a world which they want to have. And warm generation is someone like considers too many things, so they cannot decide much. Very personal person in a very complex situation. The second dimension is that whether you live in miracle time or the post-miracle time. After the we call IMF crisis in East Asia, Asian financial crisis in 1997, I visited to Japan quite often to connect the young people in Korea and also in Japan, since both of them feel so depressed. And I realized that Japanese young men were really depressed. And compared to them, Korean people still so much of hope, and they were always trying to fix things. So I thought they will like each other, but I realized that they didn't like each other at all. And so these Korean young people think that Japanese are too in despair and they cannot work. They just don't have any energy. And Japanese young people think that they listen to this cheerful, enthusiastic young men, but they just don't get any benefit from that association. So anyway, those young people, maybe in China now, I guess whether we can do something together or not is a very challenging stuff. So there's people who think still kind of utopian or believe in history, and those people who really think that this world is in this dystopia already and is in regression. History is in regression. And third one is digital literacy. I think that's the very important factor that when we want to talk about generation. Before to get into that, I want to say briefly about my view on this time we are living. We are now living in the new normal times when everything is calculated to the benefit of capital, and capital's value always override human dignity. Since no one any longer expects tomorrow will be better, life is filled with endless fears that things will only get worse, and daily joys are replaced by insecurity and anxiety. This post-growth syndrome is manifest in so many societies today and only differ in the times of their onset. Youth in their jobless and relationless condition begin to ask their voices, but with little success. When young people begin to dwell upon the question of surviving rather than living, it is time to ask where we are going and what are we up to. So today I'm going to talk about the lives of young people living in the East Asian region, especially this four dragons, so particularly Korea, South Korean, who live through the turmoil of compressed modernization led by authoritarian state and hyper-competitive educational system and familism. And I ask whether we can still talk about hope. So briefly, you see all those pictures of Korea went through in such 50 years. So we had these baby boomers of economic development were born in 1945. They are very labor addicted, Cold War politics, and very enthusiastic, very optimistic, and they are eager to learn. And we have this, we call it 386 generation. Now they are on their 50s, who went to college on the 80s, who were born in 60s. We call it 86 activist generation. So they have a strong belief in democracy and progress, and they are really deeply involved in state politics, and they have a strong male bonding. So now they get attacked through this Me Too movement by the younger generation, which is very interesting things these days. And they are very ideological. But anyway, they are the one who have a very good memories of success. They had the experience of success. We call it we generation. We always think we together, and hot and very active generation, and went through this economic miracle in 1987 uprising. We have all these movies came out. You can see how that each generation celebrate their own experience. Then we have this born in 1970s, and who went to the college in the 1990s, and this I generation, or say X generation, new generation. There's so much name like this Soteji generation, and they are very individualistic, and they always talk about diversity and cultural politics, and try to be very cosmopolitan, and they are very rational consumers, and they always talk about citizens from below and internet early adopters. So they are, I say this I generation, very cool, and they try to be very proactive. So in Me Too campaign, they are very active in it. And then we had the third generation, is some totally depressing generation to me. That like Korea is really, in a way, is kind of miracle country. And recently, you know that the president has been impeached, which is, again, is really miracle. But so we have all this impeachment through the peaceful protest of the children, of the citizens. But Korea, again, still very dystopian than most any other advanced societies, because some have compared life in the Koreas to real life Hunger Games. And actually, I studied this young generation with the 4 other young researchers in 1916. And we published our finding in our book we called The Betrayal of Effort. So how hard you try, you will be betrayed. And then now young people in South Korea began to speak of being born with a golden spoon or silver spoon or a mud spoon in their mouths. And then those born with the golden spoon in their mouth get into the best universities and secure the plum jobs, while those born with a dirt spoon work long hours in a low-paying jobs without benefit. So this Korean even has a special name, Haejoang. You know, Joseon is a phrase that harks back to the 5-century-long Joseon dynasty, in which Confucian hierarchies become entrenched in Korea, and when a feudal system determined who get ahead and who didn't. And there is a Haejoang group on Facebook, and a dedicated Haejoang website that posts graphic after graphics to illustrate the awful state of life in South Korea. The long working hours, the high suicide rate, and even the high price of snack. The most frustrating of all, many young people say it is their parents, who maybe we say different thing, but who work long hours to build the Korean dream, think that always the kids that they should try harder. And so since these parents lived through South Korea's astonishing economic rise during the 1960s and 70s, and then so democracy arrived in the 1980s. But those born after the period of rapid improvement even see only the downside. So this following the 1997 Asian economic crisis, Kim Dae-jung's democratic government tried to transform the college entrance examination system to emphasize the importance of a creative, knowledge-based economy. But in that time, the parents who get very anxious and fearful about the kids' future weren't willing to cooperate to that. They put their faith in the government. So the private education market, cram schools, exploded to exploit the insecurity of parents. And it was common for such evening cram schools to engage in the pre-teaching. So I think this crisis has such an impact. And we have this me generation, very reactive. They don't act out or proactive at all, reactive, and they really see this whole world wouldn't get better. They know it from the beginning, deep in their heart. So we call this generation spec generation. You know what is spec? Is like specification that refer to the features that you need to present in the resume in order for them to get the top jobs in the top firms such as English language school, special certificate in award, and the various work experience of internship and volunteer works. And so this, suddenly I was so shocked too in the classroom around the middle of 2000. The students were hyper competitive and really working hard. And this is a kind of advertisement by Korea University would say, we have abandoned our prestige and betray your nation, covet the world, and really emphasizing on this globalization of universities and kind of competing marketplace. So the student internalized the value of inner takes it all, and they keep saying, we want a fair reward according to one's effort. So they really hated this affirmative action. They think it's not fair. It's kind of counter, they support for that discrimination in a way. So I think it's because they have never had this chance to inculcate the sense of structure or history, but really they think on everything in terms of personal rights and obligations. So we have a book like we support discrimination kind of thing. So everybody, like parents, they really want their kids to be global elites and support financially and really push them. But Korea is one of the country that the highest rate of young people who are classed as NEET. You know what is NEET, right? Not in education, employment, or training. So don't do much. They don't. So it has the highest number. And although there are less hikikomori, it's, you know that too, right? You kind of living in your room and didn't come out as a social being. Less in Korea compared to Japan. The individuals who isolate themselves from society and rarely leave home to interact with others, they are still a large number of young people supported by their parents who are unemployed and who are both in school, actively looking for work. And we have millions of young people who want to be the idol star. So it was a huge industry, and also plastic surgeries and everything is related to that. So they also work very hard, although there's not much chance to be the idol star. Okay, and then, so many people think their dream is to be an idol star. And another question, the answer was that they want to be the son of a landlord. So Okay. So I feel that Friedrich Engels' book, I guess you all read, The Origin of Family and the private property and the state, that prophecy really come true in Korea. And so the class, it is really a class conflict, but expressed in the form of a generational conflict. And also it often comes as a gender conflict. So there is so much of misogyny in Korea now, online actually, and also this national conflict we have been discussed about. I'll skip this. I think Koreans, maybe I will talk about, this is kind of incident that last year, a trainee who was repairing a safety gate at Gui subway station in Seoul was killed in an accident. He was a contract worker who has been working steadily since graduating from high school at the age of 19 and was hoping to become a full-time employee. He was left to repair the gate alone because the repair crew was understaffed. So following this incident, we'll see on the following letter to the editor appeared in the major newspaper. I am 20 years old, who knows nothing of this world, but my friends, what does this world knows of us? Over the past 50 years, some years, people have said that this and that about the trickle-down effect, but the gap between the rich and the poor just grows wider. They say that a few decades from now, the old age pension fund will be run dry. The birth rate has plummeted, and the number of people of 65 keeps increasing. So they tell us we have to raise a bigger families, but we can't even find a job. A number of young people share this kind of feelings, and they know that whole kind of class system of the global financial capitalism. And I think the young people say, in a way, in a full kind of situation, they have these children of super rich prince and princesses. And secondly, you have a labor-addicted elite. Maybe many of you are here, belong to that. And third, we have new alternative agency from downshift tribe to hikikomori. They are doing something. To me, they are not doing much, but they are doing something for transformation. And we have violent warriors of nationalism and hate crimes. This is another thing we should really look into. So we will ask, will young people of the post-miracle generation be connected by new awareness and shared technology? And actually that Anne Ellison was saying that this slowing down of the economy and the compound disasters present opportunity to reassess the value and rhythms of social life. And there are activities in sharing economy and sharing social economies and so-called good startup companies with ecological, artistic, ethical, spiritual, downshifting communities. And this is a Haejoang Center alternative public space with a communal care and open playground and community kitchen and 100% self-sustaining house of regenerative energy. And they are always on the street. And so this is the last one. As an activist, I propose in order to promote new alternative agency, we have to give this basic income or dividend for all and use Creative Commons for a sustainable life. Not DIY, DIO, do it ourselves. And I always say that we have to give $10,000 gift on the 20th birthday of Korean young people so that they can have a gap year. And we really should lower the age of suffrage to the age of 13, I think. Yeah, because we have all those, yeah. And then use alliance for future against the AI and against or control the AI and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cho. Our next speaker will be Professor Ishida from the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo. He is professor of sociology there, and he received his PhD in sociology here at Harvard University. He's done research in the UK and also taught for a number of years at Columbia University. His research includes comparative social stratification and mobility, school-to-work transition, and social inequality over the life cycle. He's the author of a book from Stanford University Press entitled Social Mobility in Contemporary Japan, and currently he directs the Japanese Life Course Panel Survey. So, Professor Ishida.
I guess I should begin. Thank you. Thank you, James. Great. First of all, I'm very grateful to the Yonsei Institute for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss this important issue at this round table. The table is not round, but the room is round. I realize it's an interesting structure. Also, I realized that we had a kind of a brief discussion over lunch, and I realized that I'm the minority today, that I'm the only one wearing a tie to begin with. I think I'm the only one in the room, I guess. And also, I don't have any photos or pictures in my slide. My slides don't move, so don't worry. And then maybe most importantly, I'm a sociologist. And I realized that the rest of the panel, one of them is sociologist, by orientation or approach is a little different. My orientation is more actually emphasizing kind of structural element, kind of structural aspect rather than people's opinions or discourse. So I just want to give you a warning that that's how it goes. So bear with me in the next 10 minutes. I would like to actually give you upshot or conclusion of my argument first. My claim is that if we look at the macro structural level, there are concerns for intergenerational conflicts, because the topic is about generation gap, and I'm trying to address that question. And if you look at the macro level, there seems to be some concerns about intergenerational conflicts. However, if you look at the micro individual level, I think conflicts is not a term to describe. It's more about cooperative and complementary. So depending upon how you look at things, this relationship between generations show different pictures. So that's my conclusion. You can all go home, actually. Okay, let me give you a bit of kind of evidence backing up my claim. Okay, I'm not doing right. Maybe I should enter this. Okay, thanks. Thanks, James. He's very kind. Believe me, he's a very kind person. He takes care of people very well. Okay, let me talk about macro demographic change and social security kind of expenditure in Japan. This is showing the demographic structure of Japan comparing 1950 and 2015. As you can see, in 1950, Japan had a kind of bottom-heavy shape of a population pyramid. But by 2015, the shape is dramatically different. There's a huge layer of those in late 60s. That is the baby boomer population. And then even early 40s, that's the kids of the baby boomer population. But the size of the younger generation has shrunk rather dramatically. Okay, this is a proportion of those who are aged 65 and over. That's on the, you wonder whether, Does it work? No. Okay. No. Thank you. So I'm not going to rely on. You just look at the line, and that's the proportion of those who are aged 60 and 65 and over, and that is increasing rapidly in the 1990s and 2000s. At the same time, due to the decline in birth rate, the younger population getting smaller, although the extent of the change is a bit small, and the population size is also shrinking since around 2005. This figure shows the speed of population aging in Japan and the rest of the world. On your left-hand side, Japan is compared with Europe and North America. The red line is the Japanese rate. That is the proportion of people who are 65 and over. You can see that Japan shows the fastest pace of population aging. In 2010, the proportion of those who were 65 and over was 23% in Japan. And the projection shows that by 2060, the proportion will be 40%. Even compared with the Asian nations on your right, Japan shows the fastest rate, although Korea, which is a light green one, that is catching up, and China is the dark green one, it's also going up. So all these countries are experiencing a very high rate of aging of the population. Okay. Now, this figure shows the trends in Japanese Social Security expenditures. Expenditure for the elderly includes pension, medical care, and other welfare services. And over 70% of the total Social Security expenditure is indeed expenditure for the elderly. So expenditure for the younger generation, such as childcare or education, is still small. And there's a clear kind of preference for spending on the elderly as opposed to assisting the younger generation. The ratio of Social Security spending to the national income is on the red line. It's currently over 30%. And this is growing rapidly, again, due primarily to the growing expenditure for the elderly. So the financial burden of the younger generation is particularly large, especially due to the pension system. So the Japanese pension system requires that the pension contributions of the working generation, including the younger generation, is used to pay the actual benefits for the elderly. So that has been, I would say, a major issue that facing, on a macro level, the generation conflict. Let me move on to talk about people's attitudes and opinion towards the pension scheme and towards who should share the burden of the cost of the increasing pension. This is result of the survey. That's a national survey, aged 20 to 80 in 2015. It asked a question about the benefits and contribution on pension scheme. Respondents were asked about the relationship between pension payment and the pension contribution, and they were asked to choose one of the opinion. The number one is the light blue bar, which indicates that in order to retain or increase the current pension sum received, it is unavoidable that the share of payment will be increased. That's the first opinion. The second one is an orange bar, which indicates the pension sum received should be reduced in order to maintain the current share of the pension or keep down the share of payment. And the yellow bar indicates don't know or no answer. As you can see from the orange bars, younger generation in the 20s and 30s have relatively higher share of decreasing pension sum than the older generation. But even among the younger generation, the first opinion to retain or increase pension sum by increasing the share of the payment was the most popular opinion. So there's not much of a big difference in terms of opinion about the pension scheme by the age group. This is the responses to a question of who should bear the cost of the pension scheme. Basically, the responses, three responses. One is the light blue one, which is the elderly generation should bear the increased cost of the pension. The second orange bar indicates that both the elderly and the young working generation should bear the increased cost. And the gray is the younger working generation should bear the increased cost. Again, among the younger population, the orange option, which is both the elderly and the younger working generation should bear the increased cost of pension, is really the majority or the dominant responses, and there is no clear difference by age group. Okay. And then the final set of responses or the kind of evidence I would like to show is the intergenerational assistance. So assistance between the two generations. And based upon the question of, have you received any assistance for your parents, or have you provided any assistance to your parents? So this is the assistance going from one generation to the next. And first, this is from different survey. This is the survey of those who are 30 to 50 in 2017. And they were asked those questions, the previous questions, these two questions. And the proportion of people who said yes is the following, which is among the blue bars are for the assistance from parents to children. So 62% of the males and 71% of females said that they received assistance from parents. The orange bars, 53% of the males and 65% of females said that they provided assistance to parents. So pretty high kind of intergenerational assistance in both directions can be seen. This is by age group. You can see that when the respondents are young, they are more likely to receive support from parents. And when they get older, they receive less assistance from parents. And then at the late 40s, the proportion of people who give assistance and who provide assistance is about the same. This is about what kind of assistance they get by age group. The typical one is assistance in terms of domestic duties or domestic chores. If the young people are living with their parents, obviously domestic duties are the main source of assistance they get. When they get older, they get assistance about this child care or childbearing. And you can see that there's a little bit of difference in terms of kinds of support that they get from parents by age group. This is assistance from parents by economic well-being of the parental family. That is, wealthy families tend to give more assistance to their kids. There's a clear difference by economic standing of the parents. So the wealthier parents are more likely to give support to their children. Now, this is looking at the other direction, that is assistance to parents, okay? Providing assistance to parents by the age of the children. What kind of assistance? Well, they assist, help with shopping or gift giving, or they help domestic duties, or they help parents to go to the hospital or take care of the sick parents. You can see that because parents get older, when the respondents are old, they tend to take care of the parents by assisting them to go to hospital or take care of when they are sick, because the parents are getting older. This is again assistance to parents by economic well-being of the children. Here, it's interesting enough, there's no clear evidence of wealthy children giving more support to parents. You can see that, like sending cash, wealthy kids tend to extend more cash. But in terms of help with shopping or domestic duties, if anything, children with below average kind of well-being, economic well-being, are most likely to provide assistance to parents. So this shows that among the kids, the economic well-being of the children does not seem clearly to affect the frequency of providing support to the parents. I think that's all I had in terms of giving you kind of evidence. And so I'll just repeat my point, which is that if you look at the macro level and demographic changes, I think there's a serious issue about intergenerational conflict in terms of, especially in terms of the support of the pension system. But if you look at the individual level, the micro level, there are actually pretty frequent assistance between the two generations, going both directions. Parents helping kids and kids helping parents. So it's more of a cooperative or supplementary relationship if you look at the micro level. So depending upon which level you look at, you get a very different picture about the intergenerational relationship. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Professor Teresa Kuan of the Department of Anthropology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she is an assistant professor. Her first book was entitled Love's Uncertainty, The Politics and Ethics of Child Rearing in Contemporary China. And it looks at the intersection between popular advice and the lived experience of parenting among urban middle-class families in contemporary China. Currently, she's engaged in a project that focuses on the development of family therapy in China. Professor Kuan.
Hi, everybody. I am in kind of a funny position to address the questions of this roundtable because there's an obvious reason why I was asked to get involved. It's interesting hearing Professor Cho's presentation because a lot of these themes that she covered in her presentation are in fact the kinds of themes that were really relevant to the families that I got to know. They talked a lot about survival and they had a very strong sense that the education system is competitive and really kind of arbitrary in terms of the way that people are evaluated and what you get at the end of the race, but yet they really strongly felt like they had no choice but to just go with the flow. And so I looked at how they coped with that situation. The reason why I'm now in a funny position to address the questions is because following family therapists as an anthropologist, I get really confused about whether I'm looking at them as an objective social scientist or if I'm supposed to be learning something from them because I somehow am being influenced by them. So I start by saying, I'm saying this just to warn you a little bit that I'm going to be answering the questions that this roundtable is trying to answer through the lens of family therapy and family therapy theory. So Asia's growing generation gap causes and consequences. This is a really huge topic. So I decided to approach this topic by being very precise in what I talk about. So Asia's growing generation gap, this is a descriptive question, and I'll just tell some stories to get at that. Causes and consequences is a theoretical question. So for causes, I will identify just one of many possible causes, which is mobility, both geographic and also social mobility. And then for consequences, and this is the sort of family therapist coming out in me, I'm going native, basically. Consequences, I'm interested in estrangement. That gap is something that is affective, existential, experiential, embodied. And I'm interested in this question of what happens, how, when, and when and how, what happens when a family member becomes a stranger. So, okay, so these are concepts from family therapy, and family therapy was invented in the United States, but it's becoming increasingly popular in the major Chinese cities. And fusion is a concept that's been translated into as 纠缠, and then differentiation is translated as 分化. And I'm going to use these concepts to analyze the stories that I will present. And basically, I just want to say the reason why I'm turning to family therapy theory is because I think that family therapy theory allows us to present a very nuanced picture of what gap is. A gap is not something that is fixed. It's not something that's static. It's something that's very dynamic and ever-changing. And these are concepts that help us to describe the sort of fluctuations between two possible modalities of relating to one another, to intimate others. Okay, so I'm just going to share a couple of stories, so just sit back and tuck you into bed. These stories are actually from colleagues of mine who have recently published really excellent ethnographies on education and youth. So we'll start with the story of Xiaoyu. Xiaoyu is a student of automation science at Tsinghua University. One of the many students, my colleague Suzanne Bregenbeck, who's based in Denmark, she interviewed many people for her book, Fragile Elite, that's the title. Xiaoyu met her mother when she was 4 years old at the Beijing International Airport. It was her grandmother who told her that the stranger standing in front of her was someone she should call mother. Xiaoyu's parents had both worked very hard to study for the college entrance exam when it was reinstituted, and they became a part of the 出国潮 of the 1980s, educational migration to the United States. They left Xiaoyu in the care of her grandparents, and they never returned to China for work, having succeeded in their fields and established for themselves careers in American academia. They gave birth to a son they themselves raised in the US, and so they lived a different and separate life. Differentiation, in the sense of affective separation from a family member, was an inevitable outcome of the physical separation. And yet, in her conversations with Bregenbeck, Xiaoyu speaks fondly of her biological father. Automation science was also her father's major, and when asked why she chose automation science, Xiaoyu said, quote, "I usually agree with my father, and so we are very happy!" exclamation mark. So this statement is the kind of statement that my family therapy friends would just really perk up in hearing. The we here is very, very significant. And I don't have a lot of information about this family or in this case, but we see we-ness in the clinic a lot. Family therapists work in front of a one-way mirror, and I was a part of the observation team on the other side, and we often see we-ness, and it's usually in the context of an adolescent having been diagnosed with a very serious psychiatric disorder. And it's often, at least family therapy, because it's very anti-psychiatry in spirit and anti-individualization. And so they try to reinterpret psychiatric symptoms in relation to family relations. And so just to give you a really quick example, one of the cases that I've observed and I'm writing about involves a girl who's been on antidepressants for a couple of years. Nothing is working, and it becomes clear in one of the clinical sessions that she's so angry at her father that she just cannot sort of figure out a path for herself, because she's basically confused her role with her mother's role, and she's angry at her father on behalf of her mother. So it's very interesting in this case that Bregenbeck describes that we-ness has occurred, because in the family therapy clinic, we can kind of understand how the we-ness develops. It usually happens between people who live together and develop routines to just live out their mundane everyday lives. But in this case, they were geographically, physically separated. So I think it's interesting just to wonder how this kind of thing, or why this kind of thing would develop and what that's about. Okay, story number 2, also from Fragile Elite. This is the story of Sun Li, a graduate from an Institute of Environmental Science and Engineering, also at Tsinghua. Bregenbeck describes Sun Li as traveling through time, having separated herself from the world of her parents in rural Jiangsu province by climbing the ladder of social mobility with academic achievement. By the time readers meet Sun Li, she has in her hand an admission letter from an American university to continue on in her field as a PhD student. Her parents do not approve of her going abroad. They have different ideas about their daughter's future, which they enacted by building a new home for her right next to theirs. At the ripe old age of 21 years old, Swinley was the only person from her high school who has not yet started a family. My parents don't know much about the world outside China, she's quoted as saying. Her own vision of the future was to become a member of the global elite, and she deeply regretted that she and her parents no longer share the same life world. Now, you could say that differentiation and even estrangement is more likely an outcome in the case of socially mobile university students from rural backgrounds, but here again, we find contradictions. Xiaoyu's academic success has launched her into worlds both geographically and culturally distant from her beloved parents, but it is also the polluted rivers in her hometown that drive her to succeed. Environmental science would be the means of fusing her personal ambitions with hometown destiny. By the same token, Xiaoyu's parents simultaneously felt disconnection and connection depending on the context, disconnection and connection to her. They don't agree with their daughter's life plan, let alone understand her ambitions, but they also come to her defense when jealous, gossipy neighbors try to scare them with cautionary tales about children who forget all about their obligations once they go abroad. Xiaoyu tells the anthropologist that her parents do, in fact, love her and want her to be happy. Analytically speaking, we might call this a fusion of identity in the face of a common enemy. Xiaoyu will not be one of those. She will be physically distant, but her heart shall remain tied to home. So, how much time do I have? Oh, good, I can slow down. Okay, I can relax. All right, thank you. So these examples provide just one of many possible windows to look through in thinking about generation gap in China, especially, or even Asia. Of course, Tsinghua students are not representative. We would get a very different picture if, for example, we looked at the stories of vocational school students from working class families, those who have supposedly failed in the race to the top, but in fact have been sorted into the educational track by a system designed to fail 50% of test takers at the high school entrance exam stage. And this 50% is set by the State Council and the Ministry of Education, so it's a hard policy. Generation gap does not appear to be as pronounced in these cases, in these families. And this is information I have, and again, I'm drawing from another colleague of mine, Terry Warrenoff, who recently came out with this book called Classwork. And she talks about, she depicts young people talking very casually about their future in ways that even suggest a fusion of identity and aspiration between parents and children. A bookkeeping student named Liu Rui told Warrenoff, the anthropologist, "Look, I'm just a lazy student. If you go to a regular high school, you have to study every day of the week. Here at Canal School, a vocational school, we have weekends off. It's great." When asked about her future, Liu Rui just shrugged. "A lot of things can happen in a few years. Who knows? My parents don't have any strong opinions. They aren't too worried, so neither am I," end quote. So that's that generation gap. As for the question of whether young people in Asia are being drawn closer together or pushed further apart, well, this is a whole other can of worms I only have the courage to open partway. It's not something I know a lot about. But there appears to be a dramatic fragmentation of life worlds, and at lunch we talked about intragenerational differences in China being quite pronounced. I feel like 1 minute, I'll be reading about 20-something-year-old professionals participating in public speaking clubs like Toastmasters in an effort to improve supposedly poor psychosocial skills they blame a repressive society for. There are now over 400 Toastmasters clubs in China, so this is a significant trend. In the next moment, I'm reading about Kuaishou, a video sharing app popular with rural youth, produced and popular with rural youth producing and directing their own media content. Much of it slapstick and silly, and all of it derided as cruel and vulgar by the urban middle class. There are more than 500 million registered users of Kuaishou. 75% are under 25 years old, and most of them are either unemployed or hold low-wage jobs. So Kuaishou versus Toastmasters, we're talking about very different life worlds here, and its participants occupy vastly different positions in a very stratified society. But I guess I would say that if there's anything that these two sites have in common, it is that they do provide a platform for self-expression for these two groups, and you could even say a means of expressing their social critique. And it may not be very obvious. I don't know if if you're not a fan of slapstick, then it may not be easy to understand. I spent a lot of my adolescence watching Jackass on MTV, so I kind of get it. There's a sense of rebellion that you get to express in this type of cultural form. It's it's a rebellion against rational conduct, and it's a rebellion against productivity. And the things that I have been reading, that journalists have written, and things that anthropologists have said about Kuaishou as a phenomenon, it's just that that its users do in fact wear all the insults that the middle class throw at them as a badge of honor. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our fourth and final speaker is Professor Shen Yifei, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Fudan in China. She earned her BA and MA from Fudan in international politics, and then in 2010 her PhD from Fudan in sociology. And I'm very pleased to say that before she received her PhD, she spent a year and a half here at the Harvard Yenjing Institute as a visiting fellow. She's written many books. I'll just mention a few of them: Constructed Women, Contemporary Theory of Gender, Gender Mainstreaming in Chinese Politics and Chinese Policies, The Individual Family and the State in the Process of Modernity in Urban China. She focuses especially on gender, family, and NGOs, and for a number of years now has served as director of the Center for Family Studies at Fudan University.
And good afternoon, because only 10 minutes, I just directly to beginning. And I want to give very briefly introduction about the generation gap in China, but it's too diversity. And in China, you always can see the totally different, the same age, but the extraordinary two groups, some very traditional, but some very post-modernity. So today I want to choose one key word, cultural feedback, to discuss about that. I hope this word can be describe a picture about the generation gap in China. First, let me, because in order to give this presentation, I read like more than 100 papers about the generation gap. And I found that this research beginning at the 80s, because Zhou Xiaohong and Zhou Yi translate a book, Margaret's made a study of the generation gap. So then we began to do such research on that. And in 1988, there are a book about the fourth generation focused on the age and the social events. Like me, I'm the third generation, although I think I should be the fourth generation. In 90s, its generation gap is very hot topics. A lot of people on that, and we discussing about the youngs. They will challenge the whole society. They will give the new phenomena and such so on. But you can see, entering the 21st centuries, we are emphasizing the positive function of the generation gap, and less research focus on the generation gap. we use another word, generation relationship. I think the reason is that because we are entering a harmonious society, so our scholars to be called to do research give the positive effects. So you will see like the sociology research societies, very famous 2 genera in sociology, they publish the papers on the generation gap, use these words, it's before 21st centuries. And another very interesting thing is that after 2004, we began to replace the generation, the Chinese was there, with the whole post. We called it the post-80s, post-90s. And when we talk about the whole, the post, we began to short the period. Before the generation, we are most of them 10 years, but now we are 5 years. We call it the 80s, post-80s, post-85s. And people found that 5 years became a very bigger difference. Another thing is very important in the research is the Yang's research is in a downturn. Wu Xiaoying, a Chinese scholars, write a papers, say that if you see the whole Yang's generation, you will find that there are not very good research on that. In fact, when not to prepare for this presentation, I really cannot find a very deeply and data about the whole picture of the young generation. You will see that in the whole society, we begin to, some papers say that the youngs begin to disappear. That's compared with the last centuries, the 90s, it's totally different things. So this is the, I think, very important research background. And here I say that because when not to read a lot of papers, I found that we always to use the cite Margaret Mead's conception about the post-figurative, co-figurative, and the prefigurative. The post-figurative means that the young generation learn from the oldest, and the co-figuration, that means they learn each other, and the prefigurated, that means the eldest learn from the youngest. And Zhou Xiaohong, he is very famous. Also, he published several papers and also recently published a book about the generation gap. And he said that China entering the prefigurated era. Right, that means the elders begin to learn from the young generations, and he used the words cultural feedback. But it's really so. That's that's his what he said about what means the cultural feedback, and it's said the new model of the parenting generations. But my question is that it's really it's emergent. Because I read also his papers and other scholars' papers, I found that when they talk about the cultural feedback, most of them to focus on the technical feedback. For example, they using the new medias or in various appliances and the new technologies. Also, they use the cell phone and the mobile phone information search, and also use some very special, we call the mobile buzzwords, 表情符号, such so on. And in that place, you can see really begin to feedback the older generation begin to learn from the young generation, and you see the labor market. It's also to find such like we call the prefigurated cultures, because the young generation, we call the young generation means post 80s. When they work, they don't care about the other people's judgment. When they work, they focus on their feelings. So that became a very strange, different from our like post 70s. We are very to pay attention on the people, other people, how to judge me. But for the young generation, if they feel unhappy, no matter how you pay, they will leave the job. So a lot of the papers focus on the 80s. We also call it the one-child policy, the singletons. They changed the whole labor market. A lot of the papers discussing about that. So we can see this really changed. But if we talk about the cultural feedback, it's look like different. I cite some papers. For example, one paper said that we lived in the different APPs. We all use the technology, but sometimes one generation of the people, they use the APP as totally different from another generation's APP. Look like they are as isolation. For example, my daughter training me to be like a new generation, and she will put her hand like this one, then I put my face on his hand, and she said, "Oh, that's you already became new generation." But here, you know what that mean? You will see, I do that. The older generation, like the 70s, we don't know because that's only in the Douyin, like the video show. The APP is very popular recently. A lot of the stars, they do the same things. For me, it's look like no meaningful. But the young generation, they think it's very, very interesting. But you will see, if you are not like me to follow my daughters, nobody know that. I ask my friends, they all don't know that. So you will see, our older generation learn from the young generation. We just separate it. You learn, you see what you like. I saw what I like. Another example is that the same family, different WeChat. Every year, I ask my student to do some research focus on the boundary between the parents and the kids. They always discussing about should we close my WeChat to parents. And some research showed that the older generation in the WeChat totally different see the information with the young generations. And also there are another like TV series called 折天记. They here translate Flight of the Desert. It's said that it was said that more than 100 million people to see this TV series. But if you ask the older generation like 70s, 60s, nobody know that. So that's became a very interesting, and also like a fans cultures. I really want to become new generation. I always want to follow my daughters, and my daughter like the Korea stars, and I also began to love the Korea stars. But my daughter said, "You are not the fans, because I never spend money on my idols." And if I choose some idols because he or she acted very well, if she or he did not very good, I just gave up. And my daughter say, "You're not the fans culture." The fans culture means you should pay money on that. You should support. You bring the resource to the idols, and you should, no matter he or she is good or not, you should support him. So when some idols have happened some scandals, and like my generation, we will give up. But my daughters, they are teenagers. They think that's the time to support their idols. So it look like the same behaviors, but a different logic behind that. So for me, it's like sometimes I cannot understand. So sometimes I give up. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot catch with your steps." You are very quickly. And also, sometimes I discussing about the gender issues, the gender discrimination. Then I will discussing my student why you do not. There are some people that are fighting for that discrimination, but most of the people, they don't think that's very important. And I ask them why. One of my students, very interesting. She answered me. She said, "We already changed. And when we can wait, when the older generation, when they died, the whole world will be changed." So you can see we call the post-80s. Sometimes they know the motivation to change the others. They don't care the others. So for when I was young, we are think the understanding is great. We're looking for understanding, 理解万岁. But now, the generation, they think they always self-entertainment. They don't care the other people's thinking about. They don't mind. If they do not agree with you, they just let it be. Because you will die. And also like the comics, like the 二次元, so many young generations cultures we don't know. And another very important issue that when we see the mainstream culture, you seldom to find a lot of discussing on that. That's totally different. So for me, I'm very worried about that. That's Professor Wu Xiaoying write the paper said that we should be like thinking about that, because in the past the young generation always being seen as treasons. They challenge the society. So the mainstream culture want to make them to obey the orders. But now look like we just let the different voice disappears. So, but the young generation, they don't care because they had their own life, their own circles. So my question is that is the young culture mainstream culture? Of course, you see the whole society. If you see, I don't think so. So that's I want to describe in China the strength between the generation gap, not only in family but in the whole society. And in the family, it's another totally different pictures. Like Professor Kuan said, they had a very, very close relationship. That means sometimes they cannot to avoid the conflicts. They had a lot of the conflicts. And I just say something like the difference, for example, about the marriage. Young generation, that's some papers they said. The young generation think if we had the unhappy marriage, compared with the unhappy marriage, I should be singleton. That's also better. But for the older generation, they think no matter the marriage is happy or not, you should be married. So in China, the most generation conflicts, it's about the urgent marriage, 催婚. If we see a lot of papers, they talk about the generation conflicts, they focus on that because the marriage age is different and the marriage condition is different. So, and another very, very, very strange thing that recently you see a lot of the country people, youngs, they leave the countryside, went to the cities to work, and they live for themselves. They got some very modern the cultures, but when they older than 26, in the Spring Festival, they came back their hometown. Their parents already choose several men or women, let her or him to choose. Then they choose one very quickly. Maybe 3 months they will be married. Then the life lived for themselves will end. They came back a very traditional life. That's in Henan, in some place already appear such things. So we will see the very, very different things about that. So, and why it happened? Because we can see the very close boundary of the interests of the two generations. We just mentioned because in China, more than 55% the young generation, when they buy the apartments, they need the support from their parents. And the research also showed that high education people, youngs, got more support from need more support from their parents. Not like the low class, it's totally different. Also, because the aging society to come and the elders also need the youngs to help them. And still the people, most of the people compare with Taiwan, Hong Kong, and also Korea. Our research found that 90% of people married before 35. Hong Kong is between 20% to 70%. Taiwan is from 30% to 40%. But in China, we below to 10%. So Jin Yihong talk about the flowing patriarchy, say that the whole society still look like the patriarchy. The young generation still follow that. So this is like my conclusion. We are seeing the social culture. I don't think we had a cultural feedback. We still like the cultural isolation, the different. But in the family, we will see the both culture will be existed. And in the labor market, it's look like the older generation began to learn from the young generation. So the gender, when we talk about the gender gaps, it's look like very complex. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we begin a discussion here, I wanted to make an announcement, and that is that after we wrap up today, there will be a reception that I believe will be held in room 30. Is that right? So it's right down the hall here. And also, I want to express thanks, especially to James Flaherty for all his hard work in organizing this, and also Francesca behind him. And although she's absent here, Lindsay Strogatz, who the panelists know is the person who really was the main organizer behind this, but she's currently busy contributing to the next generation. She's on maternity leave. So we're very grateful for her involvement as well. Let me first throw out a question to the panelists, and then we'll open things up more generally. One thing that struck me in all of your remarks is that none of you mentioned the role of religion. And one of the things I certainly find in China I'm quite struck with after I give lectures, particularly because recently I've been doing some research on the history of the Christian universities in China. And so after I give a lecture, I'm always quite struck by the large number of students who come up afterwards to say, oh, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Buddhist, or I'm something else, but who express enthusiasm for some new religious faith that they have turned to recently. And so I just wanted to ask the panelists if you'd like to comment on that a bit, and if that in fact is a general trend across Asia, what you attribute that to and what you see as the significance of it.
I have a short answer, so I guess I can go first. And I'm sorry to keep mentioning her name, but my colleague, Suzanne Bregenbeck, having done this research with university students in Beijing, she ended up getting involved with house churches in Beijing, Christian house churches. And as you probably know already, a lot of these house churches are populated by young people and, university educated. And what she found in her research is that the house church community gives them a way to complain about their parents. And it's really kind of like a psychotherapy. There's a lot of stuff that they're working out. And, some may turn to Toastmasters or some other form of self-help, but it turns out that Christianity has been one other choice.
Mm-hmm. And when I to read the more than 100 papers, there were no papers focused on the generation, the young generation, the relationship. Because if I want to looking for such papers, I need to especially to find that. And another is that when I to talk about the young generation with them, they have very few resource to connect with the religion. Because now in China, we do not go to church. And just some like me, I will follow my parents go to the Buddhist and such so on. But we don't think we like the religion beliefs. So sometimes you can find a lot of the religion behaviors, but they don't think the religion beliefs. So that's my observation.
Other comments?
I think this religion, maybe it's related with your issues that I differentiate this cool generation and warm generation. Warm generation, they tend to obey their parents if they have money. So they go to the church together, and usually there's an evangelist kind of church. You pray to be rich and more successful. Then on the other hand, those cool generation, they are looking for more spiritual, more alternative religion, more of meditation or yoga, that kind of thing. It's a quite different approach, I think. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'm out of ammunitions, actually. I'm not sure I can say anything about it because, to be honest, religion does not constitute really just essential part in Japanese people's life. Oh, this is a sweeping statement to make, but usually the religion comes up in a particular events or occasions, such as someone died or getting married. That's when kind of religious flavor comes up. But I'm not sure, having a strong religious commitment or religion constitute any kind of serious options for even young people or even among the middle-aged or older people as well. This is completely my kind of personal impression. I'm not stating that based upon any serious kind of data. So I really feel like I don't have really much ammunitions, but I think among the young people, I'm not sure religion is an attractive option. I don't think that young people see that way.
Okay, we are open for business now, so please feel free to ask what questions you might like. I think Francesca here has a microphone, and let me James does as well. So we'll recognize some people. I think we'll maybe take 3 questions and then go back to the panelists. And those panelists who would like to answer them may answer them. You can also direct your questions to a particular panelist or to the entire panel. But please first identify yourself and also make your questions very brief and very clear. So, Victor, over here.
Thank you. My name is Victor Teo. I'm affiliated with the Harvard Law School and Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. My question is to the panel, but maybe more for Professor Cho and Professor Hiroshi. I'm interested in, when you're doing your work, I'm interested in how you, what kind of criteria or measurement do you use to come up with, to delineate the different generations? So in this case, Professor Cho, she has very interesting categories from those born from 1950s and 1960s onwards, right down to I lost count. Maybe there were 7 categories or 8 categories. And in Professor Hiroshi's presentation, I could tell there were 3 categories, and they seem to be defined by age. Professor Shen has younger and older generation, seems to be defined by mobile apps, applications, and cultural appreciation, pop culture appreciation. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on this, like who would belong to what generation, and how do you go about defining this? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Birthrate. I'm a visiting scholar of Harvard Yenching. Thanks for all the panelists for very wonderful presentations. My question maybe go with Professor Shen Yifei. I do agree with one of your conclusion that right now in the family we do understand, we do learn from each other, the generations. But I still doubt for the next conclusion in the labor market that the older people have to learn the younger one for the jobs, for some things like that. Why I do it down for that? Because actually when people enter the period of modernization, more modernized equipment were produced and people have to learn to use it. And the young people, they are so well with the modernization. So I think that if the old generation learns from the younger one, it started so many decades ago. 1950s, 1960s, not until right now. So right now people enter the post-modernism. So I don't think that all aspects the old generation have to learn from the young. For example, you give example that you learn from your daughter. I don't think that you learn from your daughter for life. You are learning to catch them, to understand them, to control them. And I don't think that this is the opposite way. So I still doubt for the second conclusion that the old have to learn from the young. Thank you.
Okay. Professor
Thank you so much for the of these presentations. I'm Wang Jianping from Shanghai Normal University, special field on history of the religion. I agree with that Professor Perry that how about the religions, you know. As a professor of the history of the religions, I think China is the fastest growing in religions, not only the Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. And so probably their generation gap is very different from the, I think, the model which all of you described in the urban, the young, educated generations, and come from the rich families, so very different. And my point is, you know, China is really difficult for any case study concerned about religions, and particularly now. So this is understandable. But as an anthropology and sociology, an important job should go to the grassroots level to study not only the life of the city and the town, but also the rural areas, the western part of China, and the people, the ethnic minorities and the religion groups. And thank you so much.
You could take one more question before returning to the panel. Yes. James?
Thank you very much. Inspiring discussion. My name is Shen and currently a visiting professor in Harvard. And let me ask two small questions. The first one is about the definition of generation. How or what define the generation subjectively? Because Haejoang, so you basically talks about the formation of the generation based on the political event and economic situation, and Kuan, so you talks about the formation of generation basically related with technology and expansion of the technology. So what is how to say the relationship between the generation, the formation of the subjective generation and historical event or historical the change? This is first question. And second question is what happened after generation gap, after the compressed modernization? Because roughly speaking, there's two different dimensions of the generation gap. One is consciousness, the other is interest. And in terms of consciousness, I think if the modernization or even the complex modernization finished or saturated, if all the modernity, all the technology, and all the modern moment are saturated in highly advanced capitalist world, maybe the difference between the generational difference in terms of consciousness shrink or decrease, roughly speaking. Because in the process of the modernization, in the process of the highly advanced or highly compressed modernization, the generational difference in terms of the consciousness is huge, maybe. But after that, what happened? Theoretically, this is the second question. Thank you.
Okay, so we've received a number of questions, some of which have to do with how we define generations, both subjectively and objectively. Some of them have to do with modernization and postmodernism and how long we'll see this kind of generation gap. and also the role of life cycle, I think. So perhaps at certain periods in a life cycle, the mother learns from the daughter, but then after a certain period of time, the mother has learned all she needs to be able to control her daughter, and that learning naturally decreases, so that there's a kind of family element as well as this larger temporal element of modernization that may affect this relationship between generations. So let me turn back to the panel and ask for your thoughts on this. Would you like to begin, Professor Cho?
This a generation thing, I think to me it's very obvious. It's there. It's created by people. So as an anthropologist, I just pick it up. In Korea, we call it new generation and student activist generation. We have a term for that. So it's not just focusing on political or just economic. It's something people feel that way, and they made that category. And the other one, this post-modernity, when the hyper modernization is over, and now we are in a post-modern era, I feel. And in that case, I really think that people will avoid each other anyway. So they will get together whom they can get together. So we don't have to worry about this generational conflict. But still, there is a voting system, right? One person, one vote. So still there is a generation, and still there is a matter of interest that shall we live for these old people, longer life, or shall we care about this generation who is coming in the future? So that's the issue. So generation issue is so important. So we somehow have to change this many systems and institutional systems, from suffrage and then this kind of, I always talk about this, giving this dividend to all the citizens.
Thanks for the questions. First, about the definition of generation, I think age is kind of a basis of distinguishing generation, but to call that generation, I think there should be kind of a shared experience, and that can be subjectively, kind of consciously put into people's mind, but sometimes it does not. And then, as Professor Cho said, probably it requires some subjective recognition to become a generation. So in that sense, I agree with Professor Cho. In terms of other questions about this changes taking place rather rapidly, modernization, kind of compressed modernization, and generation gaps questions. I'm a sociologist and work on issues of social inequality. And one thing that I can tell about the experience of Japan, but also experience of South Korea or Taiwan, where they had a very compressed modernization period, I can say that the society changed very rapidly within a compressed period of time, so that during that period, people kind of perceived there's a increased upward mobility chances because society changed very rapidly within one generation from basically the agriculturally based society to kind of post-industrial society. So people move out of the farming and move into the urban sector, and then not only in the urban sector, but from a blue collar to a kind of white collar occupation. And that changes took place in a very compressed period of time, so people can perceive the change very kind of in a very vivid way. Whereas people living in like late 1990s and 2000s, the changes in these industrial and class structure has kind of subsided, and there's very little change in the last 20 years. In that sense, it's a little difficult to kind of see the people's movement, and especially movement into a kind of upper sector of the movement, so upward chances of upward mobility. So from the people's perception, there seems to be a kind of closing the chances of moving into the upper sector of the society. So that, I think, has a impact on people's perception and also generational perception, because people who were working in the 1960s and 70s, they were able to kind of feel the chances of moving up and feel that the society is changing, and they can have a chance to move up within their generation. But people born who are in the late 80s and later, it's possible that these people feel that their chances are not greater than their parents' generation. So that may have implications for people's perception and in relation to how fast the society is changing.
No, I think using shared experience as a way of delineating generations makes a lot of sense. And it raises the question then of how salient are internationally shared experiences versus domestic experiences. So one or more of you mentioned the Asian financial crisis as a critical moment. And of course, that was not particular to any one country, even though Korea suffered it particularly seriously, and China much less so. But it's also a moment when China decided to massify higher education precisely because of the Asian financial crisis. And so it had that kind of cross-border effect. And we can think today about so many of the trends in the world, trend toward populism, toward authoritarianism, and so forth, that is presumably a reflection of certain global trends of global terrorism, immigration issues, and so forth. But at the same time, we have these individual domestic issues, 9/11 in the United States, the Tiananmen uprising in China, and so forth. And so I think also thinking about how we define those generations, whether we think of them in terms of these shared global experiences or these quite sometimes very different domestic ones, is quite important for thinking about whether they bring East Asian countries together or actually separate them by these experiences.
Yeah, I really agree. For example, that when we talk about the first generation, the second generation in China, that means the social events very important. The first is before the Cultural Revolution. The second is in the Cultural Revolution. They born or grow up in that period. And then the economic reform, then the digital generation. So they focus to, I think, the age and the social events. They share some collective identity, and they share some very similar historical, social, ideological. But when we replace the die to the whole, the post, then things begin to change. So when we use the whole, you will see they always focus just some phenomenon, not the social events. So a lot of the people, they don't thinking like they are like the typical post-80s. They will say their age is like born after the 80s, but they will think they like more traditional. So when we change like a whole, that's mean focus some like a small phenomenon. So that's the papers say.
So it's delineating them by when they are born, like after 1980, after 1990. The whole is after, and so post 1980, post 1990.
And I also want to answer this question that, I agree that not in the whole labor market, the elders learn from the young generation. But if you see the China, it's really sometimes it's crazy. A lot of the papers focus the difference between the generation. And especially if the risk investment, they always love to invest the private company, the founders is post-90s. So you will see that's we compare with other countries. Most of the country will to invest the founders maybe a little elders, but in China, a lot of the money put to such companies. So in the whole labor market, look like the young generation became very, very popular. Although they feel a lot, but still a lot of money on that. So it's like compared with the other countries, I think we still can say in the labor market in China, the young generation is very, very, very different. And another is that I think the very important issue that today in China, especially in urban China, the family relationship, more equality, parents and the kids, it's more equality in the families. Especially now we are focused on like the happy life education, 快乐生活的教育. So we focus on the feelings of so look like a little change now. That's just very briefly.
I'll just say something really quick because, to be honest, even though generation is in fact an important analytic and also what us anthropologists call a local category, it's not really one that I think with, and I tried to get around that today by talking about intergenerational connections and disconnections. But I would just say that the important thing that we need to do in a conversation like this is to be very clear in distinguishing when one of us or somebody is talking about an edic concept or an emic concept. So, I think Professor Cho is talking about emic concepts. These are concepts that people are using that they themselves made up to make sense of shared experience. And in China, we don't have those concepts. We have our own local concepts, the post-70s, post-80s, post-90s. And so it doesn't come from, it doesn't drop down from the sky. It's sort of invented from the ground up, sort of tools that people come up with to make sense of both what is shared and also what is not shared. I think that's important. So there's the emic generation as an emic concept, and then there's also generation as a social scientist might invent as a way to make sense of statistical trends and that type of thing. And then there's a third way in which, a third kind of category that we can think of, which is the commercial invention of generation. The idea of generations that get invented by marketing companies that say, okay, we need a market for this, so let's do a bunch of work and make up this thing called Generation X and sell some coffee to them. So there's a lot of different ways in which generation gets and purposes for which generation as a concept gets invented, so that has to be clearly distinguished.
Thanks. We can take another round of, final round of questions. So we have a lot over here. James, Andy Gordon down at the bottom here.
Hi, thank you for some very interesting presentations and also an interesting round of discussion. My name's Andrew Gordon, and I'm a faculty member in the history department and work on modern Japan mostly. And this last point about emic gets it, and then commercial gets at one of my two questions. Is it possible to talk about self-generated emic conceptualizations of generations with any meaning separately from the generated conceptions that come from commercial sources, media in particular, which is fundamentally commercial, even if it's platforms invented by companies that people take part in? I'm dubious about that. And you put forward a sense that there's something genuinely, authentically generated on the ground from within as a separate thing from the commercial.
Right.
And I'm wondering how the panelists feel about that. I guess I'll just leave it at that question.
Okay. Anything over on this side? There's one right in the middle there.
Well, so I'm Zain Wu from Boston University. So after the definition for generation, right? Actually, I have a question about the definition about gap. So I think our panelists actually talk about different things between generations, right? Ranging from difference, assistance. I think the gap is different. So actually, I have this question particularly for Professor Ishida, because your definition about gap is quite different. You were talking about the assistance between generations, right? But I wonder whether we can interpret this kind of assistance as gap or not gap, because in Japan or in many Asian countries, right, help or assistance between generations is a cultural thing. So I would assume that this kind of phenomena would be rather kind of stable. It won't change that much. So if you put your statistics, right, in a kind of long periods of time, I think the assistance between the generations wouldn't change that much, even though maybe, yeah, as your analysis review, right, that some economic status would affect, ages would affect, but I think if you put it in the longer term periods, then it won't change that much. So how do you justify assistance as gap?
Here, James? Professor Huang.
Thank you. I'm Ying Hong Fang from I'm a visiting scholar in Harvard Yanjing Institute. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Actually, I found that three cases are quite different: one China, Korea, and Japan. In terms of the process and extent of modernization, actually, these three kinds are different. One already achieved modernity, like Japan, and I think it's quite early. And then Korea and China is on the process of modernization. And we're talking about this here. We're talking about the consequence, the cause and consequence. And my question is about actually, like from Professor Haejoang, sorry, I'm about a Korean professor. You mentioned about a complex modernity. This I think is one aspect to understand the generation gap in Korea. My question is for all of you about what do you think of like we put modernization as a cause of this kind of generation gap? What is your opinion toward this kind of the process and the extent of modernity and its impact on the generation gap and your cases? I mean, for your just your considering. Yeah, thank you.
On the end and then in the middle. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, and then in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I have two small questions. The first question is related to like share experience globally and regionally. So I have a question maybe particularly for Yifei, because actually you mentioned the youth culture as a different generation, because actually I'm post-70s. Actually, when I was in college, I really influenced a lot actually by the Japanese youth culture. But actually, now contemporary is like influence a lot of the young generation is from the Korean culture. So actually, I'm not sure whether such a difference is like also because of the different generation maybe share more experience like with Japan and also Korean different generations. So maybe you can, it's kind of a generation gap or there's also another question is about also because I'm quite interested, how can we bring the class issue into the discussion of generation gap? Because you mentioned you share like a very interesting story, but you are from Shanghai and also you are from urban area. So basically, I'm very interested in how in contemporary China, in rural part, what's the generation gap going on there? It's the same speed with the urban area, or actually quite differently, or in what degree? Okay, thank you.
Okay, actually, not really a question, but quick.
Identify.
Okay, I'm Xu Huilin, the visiting scholar at Harvard Yanjing, and not really a question, but quick response to Professor Perry's concern about the role the religion plays in the youth generation, and if I get it right, and in the case of Taiwan, and you can see that in the local level, and there's a very important cultural events called the Zhentou, which means the parade formation, the religious parade formation, especially the Taoist religion. So, and most of the members of the parade formation is actually the teenagers, especially the those of underperformance in school, and sometimes just sometimes it's those who drop out from school. So this kind of pre-formation plays a very important social function in this sense. So probably this is the place to go. I mean, to discuss or to talk about this issue. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. One final question.
Millie Creighton. I'm here as a visiting professor with the Reischauer Institute, and I work mostly on Japan and then also on Korea. I want to thank you all for your very interesting presentations, and also express some appreciation that more than one person spoke about youth suicide rates here. So my question is directed at that as somebody who works on Japan and then also Korea, experiencing those countries, very concerned, of course, about their declining birth rates, aging populations, and frequently, although there are groups that work, of course, on issues of youth suicide, it often feels like the discussion of addressing the situation is always and somehow only about the birth rate, make more babies without a link to this issue of youth suicide rates. So, and I think in the discussion today, it was also referred to, although it was an excellent presentation by Professor Ishida, the suggestion that the lower percentage of people in the population under 65, the cause of that being identified as due to the declining birth rate. So I'm also wondering if there are other causes, one of which possibly is this high youth suicide rate. My understanding that in Japan has the highest youth suicide rate of any industrialized country, that's also impeding the numbers of people under 65, keeping in mind that if people commit suicide between 15 and 25, they're still dead when they'd otherwise be 30 or 35 or whatever, and likely are not having children themselves. And possible other causes, such as leaving, in the case of Japan, leaving Japan, and a lot of people who set up their lives outside now. And I think also these trends possibly also affecting Korea, at least with the concerns over the birth rate, and might subsequently be
Thank you very much. So we have a number of different questions here, whether sort of authentic ground-up conceptions can be differentiated from commercial conceptions of generations, whether if we're talking about assistance between generations, that's a generation gap or something else, what kinds of differences there are between Japan, China, and Korea based on the timing of their modernization. This shift from Japan to Korea as a major source of popular culture influence in China and elsewhere, and then class issue, urban-rural gap, particularly in the case of China, and then this question about youth suicide and its influence on demographic trends. So who would like to be first here in wrapping up?
I'll go first just because Gordon's question was the first of this batch of questions. I think this is such an interesting question, and there's a lot to, it's analytically exciting to ask how different types of generation interact. When in reading Fragile Elite, the reason why I turned to that book is because she has so many informants talking about generation gap. It appears in the interviews. They talk about Daigo. But in fact, when you really read the stories, you realize that this discursive idea of generation gap isn't actually how they live out their relationship to their parents. And so even in a single case or a single person, there's a mismatch between sort of different levels of experience that are in fact contradictory.
Bill, would you like to go next?
There are so many issues actually. Basically, I think the social science is making a common sense. So there are so many factors that we can consider as a image category and also ethic analysis. And I guess this basically this modern age start by youth revolution to me. It's like a French Revolution, and all those young, very different perspective, who has a very different perspective, had a revolution, get a really a huge transformation of the whole society. And then they work so hard to build a kind of industrial modern world. And once it did like a GDP or whatever reached a certain point and people have a kind of affluent society, then as you had in the States that counter culture movement comes in 1970s, right, here in US. Yeah, like hippies, and they go against their parents' generation. So it's quite universal stage, like economic revolution from the medieval, and then we have consumer or cultural or I generation, and then we have this third generation. It's quite recent of this product of neoliberalism. And what I was saying is, this world of neoliberal financial capitalism eventually will all share the same kind of sense of time and body and value. So that's what I was saying, that in Japan, we Koreans feel so kind of strange about the Japanese young people 20 years ago, and now they really feel they are in the same boat. But in China, maybe some people, or Hong Kong, maybe more on that similar whim. But so in a way, that this difference in terms of nation state culture, it may not mean that much once we have this get into this financial capitalism with this digitalized revolution. So what I was going to say is that we have to really look at that phenomenon rather than trying to find out the differences.
Although, can I just jump in really quick? I was teaching Nancy Abelman's work to my undergraduates, and it's a piece on neoliberal subjectivity, and I was just really trying to get my students to reflect on the possibility that they may have internalized neoliberal subjectivity, which Abelman in the article kind of describes as, you know, this idea that your hard work is what is going to make you succeed in life, and sort of ignorance about the broader structural conditions. And it turned out that my Hong Kong students could not identify with that argument. And this has a lot to do with the fact that they are the umbrella generation. And they were the students who, if they were not on the streets themselves, they had friends that were out on the streets protesting the way that the government treats, you know, the underclass in Hong Kong society. And, you know, when I was really pushing, at some point I stopped pushing because one student said with such despair, she said, "No, we are just hopeless." And at that point, I didn't know what else to do and what else to say, so I just dismissed class. Because here I had students that are aware of the structural conditions, and they tried to do something about it, and they felt like they were banging their head against a wall. So that was just something very striking. So maybe it's a temporality question, because the next week I realized that they have in fact internalized the ethos of hard work and other, you know, ways that they in fact didn't recognize. Professor Ishida?
Oh, okay. Let me address the two specific questions that were actually, I think, asked me. Just one is about the definition of gaps, I guess. And you are right that my talk actually concentrated on assistance. And then that was something, nothing I expected. In other words, it can be that there's no assistance between the generation. That can be a scenario. But it turns out that there are assistance in both directions, parents assisting kids and kids assisting the parents. And I thought that was a very intriguing finding. The other piece of finding that I would mention is that the parental wealth or kind of economic well-being of the parents make difference in terms of how much support that they provide to kids. In other words, wealthier parents are more likely to provide more assistance to kids, and that's also an interesting part. So you said that it's the culture, it's out of culture, but sure, but culture can change, and then there are differences by class, so to speak, in terms of the extent of intergenerational assistance. I think you cannot quite explain that simply by class, by culture. Sorry. The second point is about the relationship between declining birth rate and suicide rate.
It's more the idea that the suicide,
right,
pumping up the birth rate, is not going to be sufficient.
I see. True. Yeah, I never thought about linking the two. So it was kind of
unusual.
okay. It was an eye-opening thing. I never thought about it. So I like to think about it. But the main reasons for declining birth rate, as you probably know, is one is the number of kids born into the married couples is decreasing. It's not like married couples don't have kids, but they have kids but fewer kids. So that's one thing. The other is that there are increasing number of people who don't get married because there are very few out-of-marriage babies born in Japan, very few. So in order to have babies, you have to get married, so to speak. And then, in fact, getting married, being pregnant is a very good reason to get married, at least in Japan. Yeah, because 1/4 of the babies born are what you call shotgun marriage. Is that the right term?
Yeah.
Shotgun. Yes. Shotgun marriage is a weird term to use, at least for me. But anyway.
It's kind of a derogatory. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay. Sorry. All right. So, but anyway, no one thought about the relationship between youth suicide and declining birth rate. So I take it as an interesting point to pick up. Thank you.
Professor Shen?
Yeah, so I just combine the different questions to be the same question, like what's mean the generation gap and all that. And we can analyze the generation gap from the different perspective. But for me, I always focus on like the different groups, their lifestyle, and how they explain their lifestyle. And if you see like we call it the post-80s, if you put in the rural China and urban China, of course they're different. But if you control the gender, the class, you still find that the generation gap is very significant because the two generations, they were totally different lifestyle and a totally different explain. So I don't think we can do some research to include the whole people. We always like control some, I think, the items like the gender, class, and so on. So when I do some generation gap, I still found that you can see we are feeling the gap became now, the ages became more and more close because they really had a different lifestyle and a different explain for that. So in the rural China, like that, in the urban China, also like the logic is different, but the gap, we can see that. So that's why I think the topic is significant and needed to do more on that. But I have to say, today I gave the presentation focus on the others research. Yes, we like absent a lot of materials on more detail on that. That's maybe in the future we should do more. I think that's the aim of this seminar.
It is indeed, and we've gone well over time. So let me thank all of you for your patience and invite you all to join us down at the end of the hall in the Doris and Ted Lee Gathering Room. I think it's called Room 30 for a reception. And please join me in thanking all the panelists for their contributions.